But our history teacher, this was really funny. Like, we talked about the World Wars. We just kind of breezed over World War I, and he was very excited to talk about World War II.
We had a teacher who was very similar.
Hello and welcome to the Worldwide Honeymoon Travel Podcast, the podcast that talks about all things couples travel, including destinations, tips, advice, and more. I'm Kat.
I'm Chris.
And this is episode number 240.
Are you ready for tonight?
For you to play beach volleyball?
For you to play.
No, I'm not.
You're subbing in.
No, I'm not.
We needed sub.
Absolutely not. That's
No.
not happening, right? Okay.
Just a spectator.
Okay. I'm fine being on the practice squad, but I am, as I mentioned, I think in the previous episode when we talked about the Olympics, I am terrible with sports with balls. I am terrified of the ball when it comes to volleyball. And I
Really?
Also have like no hand-eye coordination. So it just doesn't work for me. So, absolutely not. I'm very happy to be a spectator, but I don't need to be playing.
Fair enough.
So I will cheer you on. Any updates from this week so far?
I don't think so.
We're heading to Canada next week.
We are.
We're going to Vancouver and Kelowna.
Yes.
Which thankfully the wildfires have gotten better in Kelowna.
Yes.
So that's still happening. But yeah, that's our last big trip of 2023 that we're going on. Yeah, just relaxing post jet lag. And any highlights before we get started in this episode?
Highlights from the past 48 hours?
Yes, since we recorded last.
Let me think. Highlight really isn't coming to mind. I don't know. It's been a good week so far.
Yeah, mine is I had both my annual thyroid ultrasound and follow-up done because I know I've probably discussed this before, but I have like Hashimoto's / like hypothyroid and some nodules on my thyroid, and I know last year it was really scary because I had to get some biopsies and stuff done, but all is good. My ultrasound came back pretty well, and my nodules have gotten smaller, so all is good for the year. So I'm very relieved to hear that before we go to Canada for our next trip.
I am too.
Yes.
So last episode we talked about how to spend 1 week in Normandy.
Yes.
And in this episode, you are going to do a deeper dive into the full day tour of the D-Day beaches, correct?
Yes, because I couldn't do that. I couldn't do it full justice in the episode about how to spend a week in Normandy. There's just too many details.
Details.
But I highly recommend going on a tour because I can only give you an abbreviated version of the tour during this versus a full 8-hour day tour that with an expert tour guide can give you. So yeah, but yes, the D-Day beaches in Normandy, probably what most Americans think of when they think of visiting Normandy or the D-Day beaches, that and probably the Mont Saint-Michel, the tidal island. All right, without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about what it is like to go on a D-Day beaches tour from or inside of Normandy, specifically from Bayeux, which is where I took the tour from.
Okay. So you were with your sister on this trip. Was this something that both of you guys wanted to do? Was this more a choice of one or the other? How did this come into play?
Well, I knew that because of France Voyager and my blog, and knowing that this is a very popular thing to do while visiting Normandy, I needed to go and see it for myself. But I didn't feel like doing it by myself on my own was going to do it justice, quite like going on an actual guided tour. So that's why we booked the tour. And then my sister was interested in it too. She was like, well, I mean, while we're in Normandy, we have to see it. It's kind of a thing you have to see while you're there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I always like to go on tours for this type of stuff rather than just go and see it by myself.
Yes, it certainly beats having to go to, because there's lots of museums at a lot of these sites too are around the area, so you can go and get a little bit more context, but it's much more entertaining to have a guide tell you stories and different things versus reading it all in a museum and then going to the beaches and things like that.
Yeah. Were you familiar with D-Day, all of that kind of stuff? Like Like, what was your level of familiarity with it before going?
I knew that it had happened, obviously. I knew that it was successful. I knew about the beach landings. And we did have a history teacher in high school, an American history teacher, that certainly, while you learn kind of all of America, like, not all, but, like, you learn, like, American history essentially from, like, the Revolutionary War up until modern day. But our history teacher, this was really funny. Like, we talked about the World Wars. We just kind of breezed over World War I, and he was very excited to talk about World War II.
We had a teacher who was very similar.
Yes. It's like they're like, oh, yeah, World War I happened. Whatever. Okay. Let's get into World War II. And I'm like, well, you need World War I to kind of, that's kind of leads to World War II. So yes, I do remember him being very excited to talk about it. But as far as the D-Day goes, I feel like, I mean, I was aware of it. I knew about it. Was I an expert? No.
Okay.
Yes.
So what were your first impressions when you guys started the tour?
Well, starting off, our tour guide was fantastic. He had read and knew so much about D-Day, specifically World War II, and he knew so many stories that he had heard from all of his research, but also from people that have been on the tour, having family members that have been on it as well. He had so many stories, or stories passed down from other people, tour guides and stuff too. So I feel like it was great to have a tour guide to bring context, and not just context of all the nitty gritty details and the planning that went into D-Day, which was quite substantial. And we did get a brief of that, did get a briefing of that as well during the tour, but he added the stories, he added the humanity to the war that I think that the museums can't always do, that the tour guide really helps with, especially an experienced tour guide.
Awesome.
Yeah. So great. I thought it ended up being one of the best tours I've ever taken, and the day flew by, which was insane. I was not expecting that. I went in being like, okay, it'll be cool to learn more about the D-Day beaches and get some more context, because it was a significant thing that happened in World War II, but also in Normandy. So it's certainly something I wanted to do. But to leave that tour being like, oh my goodness, the day flew by, and it was probably one of the best tours I've ever taken, was crazy.
Okay.
I was not expecting that.
So walk us through how we got to one of the best tours you've ever taken then.
This is not sponsored. I'm just saying this ahead of time. I found this tour just on Get Your Guide, but it's through Ophorus, is the tour group.
How do you spell it?
Ophorus. And I'm sure I'll be writing all about this for France Voyager soon. But we got this tour, and if you get Matt Turner or request Matt Turner, he was a phenomenal tour guide. I'm sure Ophorus has some great tour guides for all of them, but Matt Turner was just excellent. He's a very proud Yorkshireman that now lives in Normandy with his Irish wife. When she talks about, he has 4 kids, so he's like, I'm used to talking a lot. But yeah, so it was a fantastic tour. It was a full day tour of the D-Day beaches from Bayeux, okay? And it costs about 150 euro, or about $160 to go on this tour. It starts around 8:50 in the morning, where you meet at Quebec Square in Bayeux, until about 5 to 5:30 p.m. Round trip to Bayeux. And some of the stops will include Pointe du Hoc, Utah Beach, Sainte-Mère-d'Église, Omaha Beach, and then the American Memorial, like the cemetery in Normandy. Yes. And if you're lucky enough to get a guide like Matt Turner that is extremely knowledgeable, they give him free reign to do the tour in the order he sees fit. So even though on Get Your Guide it mentions like you start at Utah Beach or something like that, and then you work your way down, and then you get home at 5, we actually got back at 5:30 so that we could end the tour with a highlight at the American Cemetery as it is wrapping up for the day. And then, which he asked us if we were okay with doing and getting back later. And then he kind of started it as he saw fit, and it actually made a lot of sense that way. But yeah, do you want me to start talking about the tour?
Please, take me through it.
Well, I am not going to do it nearly as much justice as that tour guide did, for sure. But we get picked up from Bayeux, and then we drove first to Pointe du Hoc.
How long are you in the car here?
I really don't remember, because he talks from the second you get in the car until, like, because he gave a lot of history and context beforehand. So it flew by the ride from Bayeux to Pointe du Hoc, but maybe 45 minutes.
How large is the tour?
We're all in a big van, so I want to say there were 7 of us.
Okay. Okay, so it's not a bus or anything like that.
No, it was a small group tour, which was
Okay.
also really great.
Awesome.
And honestly, I don't know how long the drive was because he talked the whole time and gave us lots of context from both sides of the war. What led Germany ending up World War I, being in poverty and things like that, and, you know, Hitler and all of that coming into power, how that kind of led to the events to World War II. And then also talked about the Allied forces and what kind of led the United States into the war with Pearl Harbor, and all of the different dynamics of that and how they eventually got into the planning of D-Day. Because D-Day is it wasn't just Americans. There were the British, the Canadians, etc. We just focused more on the American parts of the tour, like Utah and Omaha Beaches, which were the American beaches that they landed in. But lots and lots of story and context at that point. And then we get there to Pointe du Hoc, and he said this is going to be the most realistic looking of what it looked like the day that D-Day happened.
What is Pointe du Hoc?
Pointe du Hoc it has 35-meter cliff area along the beaches in Normandy, and there are tons of German military bunkers there. 6 feet wide, ginormous, like bulletproof or bomb-proof kind of like shelters happening there where they could keep an eye out on the cliffs and see if anyone's coming. That was a strategic place. And he mentioned about the Germans having to stay there. I think it was like a week. No showers, no like restrooms, that sort of thing. They slept, I think it was like 20-something to one little room in bunk beds. So they were very stinky and disgusting after, before they got to rotate to go to the nearest village. But it was such a impenetrable bunker that if someone were to attack and you were in that bunker, you're stuck. I mean, you either leave and go to your death by someone killing you out there, or you're trapped inside with no food, or you run out of food and water eventually.
Wow.
So giving us context for that. So what happened at Pointe du Hoc was that there are actually 3 parts to D-Day. There are the paratroopers, the people doing the beach landings, and then the U.S. Rangers landing at Pointe du Hoc. All right. And so before D-Day happened, they had bombed a lot of this area in hopes of where they actually had some old French, big giant guns for defense, that the Germans took over. There were a few of them at Pointe du Hoc. And so their goal was to either damage or have the Germans essentially retreat those guns to keep them safe, so to speak, because they didn't have the means to fix them right away, essentially. They dropped so many bombs. There are still bomb craters all over this area that you can still see today, and pieces of the cement from some of the places that were some of the bunkers that were hit, where pieces of it had blown off.
Wow. So
you can see that to this day still. Whereas the beaches, it's pretty much, they look like a beach at this point. But so you see that they only managed out of all the bombs they dropped to hit one of the guns. But that was enough for the Germans to do what they wanted them to do, which was hide them, to get rid of them so that they're not in that area. Because what they did was have 225 U.S. Rangers land on that beach. They would have to scale that cliff and then climb up and try to take over that area.
Oh my gosh.
So they wanted the guns obviously gone for that reason, but they still obviously faced challenges from the Germans fighting back and that sort of thing, and getting up the cliff. Landing, you have to land in the right spot, get up to the right spot, or put the ladders in, etc., to get up this cliff. And it was very challenging, to say the least. And they had a very limited amount of time to do it, especially with the tides and everything, because like I said in the last episode, Normandy has the second highest changes of the tides in the world, the first being the Bay of Fundy in Canada. So there was a lot of things that they had to do. And you know what's crazy is the fact that they landed, I think, around the right time, but in the wrong location, because of there was, I guess, a lot of wind and stuff that day, so the tides kind of didn't take them to the right spot, but it ended up working out in their favor that happened. I feel like that happened a lot this day. There was a lot of mistakes and errors that happened, but somehow it made it better. So anyway, the 225 raiders ended up going up there. There certainly were some fatalities doing that, but they were able to overtake the Germans, who, instead, knowing that they couldn't just hide in the bunkers to protect themselves because they would die, fled to the nearest village where most of the other Germans were at.
Wow.
So that is how they successfully took over the beach.
Okay.
So that's Pointe du Hoc. So that's kind of part 1 of D-Day. All right. Next, after that, After that, we stopped at a place that actually nobody really stops at because we just had this great guide who took us to an off the beaten path place, but with fantastic stories. So here we stopped at Place Toccoa Memorial and the church that's there. And this is where the paratroopers come into play. So the paratroopers were trained to land in the middle of the night out of planes, essentially. And they landed in fields, and then they were meant to take over the towns one by one and start basically liberating the towns from the Germans. And there were a couple of paratroopers that were named as medics, and they were, I think there was one who had 2 months worth of training and one that had 2 weeks. So not many. Medics were essentially just first aid people. They couldn't do too much. They could pack them and send them off to the actual military hospitals that were outside of the battlefields. But there were 2 men, Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore, who had landed in totally separate areas. They weren't even from the same paratroopers group. Landed in different spots because, unfortunately, another thing that went wrong with the paratroopers is that it was a cloudy night. So they couldn't just easily land in their spots. So a lot of them ended up landing all over the place instead of in the designated areas, which apparently worked out well because there was one designated area next to a big German military hotspot that if they had landed there, they probably would have been killed.
Oh, wow.
So it was actually a good thing that it was a cloudy night and that a lot of them landed all over the place, but then they had to find each other after that so that they could attack the villages. So what happened here was that Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore both found this church. They landed in different places, found this church, were like, you know what? This is a great place to set up an aid station. All right. And this is a story you're not going to see probably anywhere else except for on this tour. These 2 guys set up an aid station, and the aid stations treat both sides. That's just what they have to do. I don't know if you've seen that in like other shows like Outlander and stuff like that. They treat everyone that comes
like
in.
Outlander.
Well, I know because Claire's a nurse, and so she worked in the war and stuff, and you treat everyone.
Yes.
So that's what they did. It's a gun-free zone. So they did end up, everyone there had to surrender their weapons because they had both sides coming in and saving. They managed to save, I want to say it was like 80, they saved almost everyone but 2 people that came in. It was like 90-something people.
Oh my gosh.
That they saved. And this tiny, tiny little church, nobody knows about it. There are bloodstains on the pews from this. There was actually one of the guys who was dying. They were going to give him morphine, and he said, I think someone else is going to need it more than me. And he ended up dying, and there was an 11-year-old child whose house got burned during that. And he was the only one who survived out of his family, of this French family that just lived on a farm. And they took him in there. They used the morphine, and it ended up saving his life. And then he ended up growing up, and he ended up moving to Britain, was adopted, all that stuff. He moved back, got married in that church, and got close to those soldiers, and he became a doctor.
Wow.
Doesn't that touch your heart? He ended up becoming a doctor because of that.
Wow.
But these 2 men received the highest awards you can get as a medic in the military for their efforts for all of the people that they saved during that time, and you just don't even see about it. The church is, and this is even cooler, the church is actually dedicated to 2 saints that are angels that have descended from heaven to help heal and bring mercy. And they were like, that was fulfilled when these 2 soldiers came as paratroopers to this church and saved all of these lives. And so they did these, they remade some of the stained glass windows dedicated to these people, and Robert Wright actually has part of his ashes buried in the cemetery next to the church. And he's been there for ceremonies and stuff like that during his life.
That's incredible.
Yeah, because after the war, they kind of went their separate ways. They were in different units, but they eventually met up later in life and became friends, Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright. So it was such a touching, heartfelt story, and almost all of us were crying while he was telling it.
That's very touching.
Yes, and I just think it's crazy. So that's what I mean by the context, because I never would have known about this church. I never would have gone here if it weren't for our tour guide knowing about it and telling us about it. And one of his one of his other tour guides was giving a tour and brought them there, and it was Robert Wright's son.
Wow.
Mind blown. It's crazy. Anyway, so after that, we go to St. Mary d'Eglise, which is a tiny, tiny town. And you may be aware of this one because it is part of The Longest Day, which is an older World War II movie that features the paratrooper that landed on the church.
Oh, yeah.
In the middle of the city. And his name's John Steele. there are many stories of whether or not it actually happened, if he landed on that particular spot in the church and watched everything going down. John Steele certainly never denied that, and he would come to the ceremonies and stuff after. But really interesting, all the speculation and the stories around that. But then you have the old 1960s whatever movie prop still hanging from the church. And then you go inside and you can check out, there's some stained glass windows dedicated to the paratroopers. And in fact, there was a child. They asked everyone in the town to draw their interpretation of what happened that day. And a child drew Mary holding Jesus as a baby with the paratroopers landing. And they actually turned that into a stained glass window in the church.
Man.
Yeah, because they were like, well, how beautiful, it's like coming from the eyes of a child or something.
There's so many neat, like, intertwining details.
Yes. Yeah, it's a lot. So that's kind of the paratroopers. Again, something didn't work out. It was a cloudy day. They didn't make their marks, but then it ended up being better. More of them survived because they were meant to have a higher mortality. Being paratroopers and landing with 90 pounds worth of equipment near German soldiers and military bases. And they survived and were able to liberate many, many towns. And that's how that worked for the day. So that's kind of part 3, or part 2, if you will. And then after St. Mary de Glees, we went to Utah Beach. And so this is where the part 3 of D-Day comes into play, where you have the people landing on the boats to the beaches to take over. And luckily, Utah Beach wasn't as deadly as Omaha Beach. So Utah Beach was where a lot of the American soldiers went. Again, it was the right time, wrong place, because the tide sort of took them out. But that somehow worked for them. And some context to the Germans at the time, our guide was telling us that about 25% were the radicals, right? They're the ones that were like, we believe in all this stuff that Hitler's saying. But then the rest of them were either, at this point in the war, very old men who were forced to fight, very young boys forced to fight, like 11 to 14 years old, some of them.
Oh my gosh.
So they don't know anything, or, and then you have foreign prisoners of war from other, just all over the world, that they're like, well, hey, you can either die in, war camp, because a lot of them were, it was disgusting and unsanitary, or you can live and get paid if essentially you risk your life and fight for the Germans. So as you can imagine, on Utah Beach, they have very little incentive for the elderly who don't care what's going on. Like, they're just like, I'm at the end of my life. Why am I doing this? And then you have the young that really don't know what's going on. And then you have the foreigners. Those were the people mostly manning the beaches at Utah Beach, at least according to this tour. They did not have a ton of incentive to fight back because they were like, oh, well, you took it. And because they don't really have any motivation to keep this war going. But this beach is also known, so they were able to clear a path and get soldiers because they wanted to land, clear a path, and then get to the villages and start liberating was essentially their goal. And there's a story about Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who fought here. He was not elderly, but he was older at this time, and he requested 3 times to help, and they kept denying him. And then they finally let him do it, and he bravely led the people bravely led the soldiers. He even sat on the beach. And was guiding soldiers through back and forth to get onto land to be able to go and liberate the villages.
And this is, you said Theodore Roosevelt Jr.?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So very, very brave. And this is what sucks, though. So he is one of the 3 people that was awarded the, what is the big medal? Medal of Honor, or why am I blanking on it?
Purple Heart?
No. It's like the highest
Congressional Medal of Honor?
I think so. I think it's like the highest medal that you can get for fighting and bravery in the military. He got that posthumously because while he survived D-Day, he died 36.
He got it what?
Posthumously. Posthumously.
Got it. Oh, okay. Okay.
Because while he survived D-Day, he ended up dying of a heart attack 36 days later.
Oh my gosh.
And he didn't make it home, which breaks my heart. I heard that and I was like, no. So yeah. But anyway, so this is part 3. They're landing on the beaches. They were able to overtake Utah Beach without as much struggle as they had originally thought. A lot less people died than they originally thought would, so that's great. But then the last beach you visit is Omaha Beach, and there are memorials here for the deaths that occurred, because this was the deadliest beach for the Americans during D-Day. And that is because there were a ton of obstacles in their way, and they had more battle-hardened Germans ready to fight versus the elderly, the young, and the foreigners who really are like, I'm just doing this so I don't die in prison camp. So a lot more difficult, a lot more obstacles, landed again, right time, wrong place. But the first 2 waves that landed in the boats had a 90% fatality, like mortality rate. So it was basically essentially where you have they're throwing as many people as possible until someone gets through, which really, really sucks if you're the first couple of waves.
Oh my gosh.
So a lot of people did pass away during that. But they ended up clearing a path eventually. It took them a while, and then they were able to take over and start liberating the villages.
Imagine being one of the people in those first few boats, right?
Yeah.
And you know that when you land,
you're probably
going to die.
Yeah. It's really sad.
That's harrowing.
Yeah. And even our tour guide told us that these 3 things, the paratroopers, the rangers, and the people in the boats, had to, everything had to line up for this to be successful. Because if the paratroopers didn't land in and automatically start liberating the villages, it would be a lot harder. Like the Germans, there would be more Germans essentially at the beaches to defend themselves versus trying to defend the villages. So it would have ruined all of the plans of the people on the boats and the rangers. If the rangers hadn't done it, they wouldn't have overtaken this huge area. If one didn't work, the rest of it would have failed. So it was everything had to work.
It's like a big
was
train of dominoes.
And they even picked the date specifically because of the weather. And then the weather still ended up being not that great. It was rainy, it was drizzly, it was cloudy, so cloudy that the paratroopers could not land properly, that the tides were messed up, but somehow that ended up working in the Allied forces' favor. So just incredible. And I learned all of this on the tour, which was great. But yes, at the end of the tour, we visited the American Cemetery, which overlooks Omaha Beach. And it is where 40% of the American soldiers who died on the battlefield on D-Day are buried. Because they were given the option of, once France was liberated, they gave land. It's French land, but it's basically managed by the U.S. For them to bury their dead from D-Day. And families of those who passed away were given the option to bury them there at this cemetery that is... It looks like a golf course. It's just so the grass is perfect. Nothing is left to chance. Everything is very symmetrical and beautiful. It's very highly honored and respected. Or they would take them home to bury them with their family and things like that. And they would cover that expense. The military would. So they were given that chance. So we did visit the cemetery, and it's huge. It's beautiful. There are memorials. There's even a memorial to the people who they couldn't identify the bodies and things like that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's and there's a little chapel that thanks them for giving their lives to save others and all of that stuff. So it's crazy to see, and the amount of people buried there. It's just, I'm shocked because that's only 40%.
I have chills right now.
Yeah.
I haven't seen pictures. I haven't seen anything like that yet.
Yeah.
And this seems like a very moving tour.
It certainly is. It's very moving. Yeah, and it overlooks Omaha Beach. It's a beautiful cemetery, and our guide was like, hey, if you guys don't mind getting back a little later, at 5 o'clock, they do the flag lowering ceremony of the American flag.
Oh, wow.
And so the first one is done, there's 2 flags. The first is done in silence as respect, and then the second one, they play taps. And so, yeah, it was definitely worth it. I'm glad we got to stay behind to see that happen, and we were able to pay our respects and things like that. But yeah.
That's the tour.
That's the tour. Then we go back to Bayo, a changed person after that tour.
I bet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that you did not mention, and this isn't nearly as important as everything else you mentioned.
Sure. Well, obviously I can't mention everything.
was there lunch?
Oh, yes. Sorry. We had lunch at the St. Mary d'Eglise town.
Oh, okay.
Just grabbed something at a bakery. There are restaurants there too, but our guide was like, hey, I can tell you guys more stories if you just want to grab something at the bakery, and we'll...
Like a takeaway.
Yeah, like a sandwich or something, and we'll talk. And that's what we all ended up doing, because we were like, oh, we want to hear more. There's so many stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're like, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a great bakery too, because they have fantastic pastries. So Amanda and I got a bunch of pastries too.
Is this something that you would recommend for a honeymoon?
There was a couple on their honeymoon.
I remember you saying that in our last episode.
Yes.
Because I could see it go both ways, I guess, right? Like, number one, it's not the most romantic thing to do, in the traditional sense. But on the other hand, you and I always talk about those experiences that change you.
Mm-hmm.
And this certainly seems like one of those humbling, reflective sort of experiences, which I always enjoy when I have with you when we're traveling, but maybe a return trip.
Yeah, I just think it depends on the type of honeymoon you're going for. If you just want to do beaches in Paris, maybe not. But I feel like it's a specific type of person, someone that loves history, really wants to go to the D-Day beaches. It's something on their bucket list. Sure. But I probably wouldn't. Maybe it would be a return trip. But I highly recommend it. It was an incredible, incredible tour.
Is it something that you would do again? Like if we went to Normandy, I would be very interested in this. This was not this past year, but the year before when you were in France. I started a World War II documentary, and I ended up not finishing it because like you got home and then I was like, I'll just watch it again. And I forgot about it until you've been talking about this. Is this a tour that you would do again, or would you want to do a different one, or would you say, you know what, just go ahead and do it?
I would do it again.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we might be going back to Normandy next year for a wedding.
Sure.
So if we have extra time, I would definitely do it again. It's a very moving tour. I learned a lot. It made me interested to learn more. Fantastic. I mean, the tour guide made all the difference too. He did a really great job.
That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, that wraps up what it is like to go on a D-Day Beaches tour around Normandy for the full day from Bayeux. So if you guys have any questions or comments, anything like that, you can always reach us on social media at Worldwide Honeymoon, except for X, which is at WW Honeymoon, or you can email Kat at worldwidehoneymoon.com. But thank you guys so much for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to rate and review our podcast. It takes less than a few minutes and really helps other people find us. Also, if you're enjoying this awesome free information on both the blog and podcast, when you're booking your next trip, head over to worldwidehoneymoon.com/resources and use the links provided. We earn a small commission at no cost to you when you book through these links, and these are all brands and companies we know, love, and use, like Skyscanner for finding the best flight prices, World Nomads for the best travel insurance, TripAdvisor for hotel bookings and reviews, and even Amazon for all of your travel purchases.
Thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Wherever you are, wherever you go, remember to make every day a worldwide honeymoon.